Great. Sweet baby gang. Representing there. Good. Got a lot of them in here. So we got a few sweet baby gang and then a lot of confused people also, which is what it's all about. So thank you so much for being here, everybody, and thank you to the Western Conservative Summit for having me. You know, what I want to talk about is, as you may have noticed, we live in a culture that seems to have completely lost its mind. We are living through a period of mass psychosis that is very truly unprecedented in the history of human civilization. It seems as though all at once, millions of our countrymen sort of woke up one day having forgot some of the most basic facts about reality, like a giant epidemic of just the weirdest sort of amnesia. And lying at the heart of this intellectual chaos is the confusion, or apparent confusion anyway, over human biology. A mental disease called gender ideology has gripped hold of a large swath of the American public and totally taken over almost all of our, or in fact all of our most powerful institutions. The disciples of this cult have been convinced, or pretend to be convinced anyway, that men are women, women are men, that men can have babies, women can have penises, that a woman can impregnate a man who can then give birth to and breastfeed a child, that somehow the most basic facts about reality and about biology, facts which all people everywhere across the entire world for thousands and thousands of years all recognized intuitively, are no longer valid. It's total madness, and it's a madness which has infected our society and now is threatening, I think, to tear it apart at the seams, already is in fact doing that. It was for this reason that I, along with my extraordinary team at the Daily Wire, decided that we had to make a film which just premiered on the Daily Wire and has angered the left so much that there was even, and still is, a sustained cyber attack on the site to shut us down and prevent people from seeing it, along with all the other tricks they're pulling around this thing. The film is called What is a Woman, and it documents my year-long journey to confront and expose gender ideology. It was a journey that took us all over the country, from San Francisco to Seattle to New York, many places in between. It took us even across the world, deep into the bush in Kenya. It took us to other third world countries too, like Los Angeles, for example. Now, our goal broadly was to explore gender ideology, to kind of show it for what it is. And as the title suggests, this larger goal centers around one seemingly quite simple and specific question: what is a woman? Now, back it up a few years, it occurred to me sometime shortly after Bruce Jenner became Caitlyn and was immediately declared Woman of the Year, back in like 2015, I think it was, that the word woman ceases to have any meaning if a guy named Bruce can be considered one. The word man, too, is emptied of all meaning. It occurred to me also that this is a major problem for the left, for the people promoting this agenda, because if the word woman no longer means adult human female, then what does it mean? And the left, if they cannot tell us what it means, then how can they use the word? And if they cannot use the word, then how can they have women's marches and talk about women's rights or say anything else about women if you don't know what the word means? Indeed, how can a man say, I identify as a woman, if the word woman doesn't mean anything? Isn't that about as meaningful as me saying that I identify as a who's-he what's-it or a flifferdoodle? You say, well, what is that? Well, that's nothing. How can anyone identify as gibberish? And if they do identify as gibberish, how are we supposed to affirm or respect that? I couldn't affirm gibberish even if I wanted to, and I don't want to. So it became obvious to me that this question, what is a woman, presents an insurmountable logical problem for the left. And so I kept asking the question and asking it and asking it and asking it in every form available to me for years and years. But they simply ignored the question to the extent that they could and carried on pretending like their worldview was not fatally incoherent and self-contradictory. Well, after years of this game of them ducking and dodging the question, the big question, what is a woman, I finally decided that it was time to take the question to them, to sort of put it in front of their faces, confront them directly with the incoherence of their beliefs. Well, I could do that, or I could just drop the whole thing, but I don't drop anything, so instead I decided to travel across the entire world. And that began the quest that became the film, which is now available on dailywire.com to watch. We spoke to alleged experts, doctors, therapists, professors, surgeons. We spoke to trans people themselves. We spoke to activists. We spoke to politicians. We spoke to average people on the street. We spoke to nomadic tribesmen living in huts made out of cow dung. And those were by far the sanest voices that we came across in the journey. We spoke to everybody who would speak to us. Surprisingly, I only had to use a bullhorn once. And I learned quite a bit through this extraordinary and often bewildering and sometimes funny, but often disturbing adventure. Some of what I learned was a revelation for me. Other lessons I sort of already knew, so I had to relearn them. And in either case, it was enlightening, and just as I hope the film is enlightening for the viewer. So what I want to do now is talk about I'd say 5 main lessons that I learned or relearned through the course of this project and in researching the subject as we went along. I've spent basically a year fully immersed in the most vile and toxic lunacy that the world has ever known. And it has not been good for my, as they say these days, mental health. But I did learn these things at least. So number 1, what I learned is that gender ideology is totally, absolutely pervasive. This is not, as conservatives sometimes like to reassure themselves, strictly the province of gender studies professors and weirdos on TikTok, many of whom are gender studies professors as it happens. The basic tenets of gender ideology, that gender is fluid, that people can decide for themselves whether they're men or women, that transgenderism is a valid and healthy state of being, which should be encouraged and affirmed, that sex is not binary, that there are dozens, if not an infinity, of valid identities outside of man and woman. These beliefs, however half-baked and incoherent they may be, can be found everywhere in the country. Stop any average person on the street. I've done it. No matter what they look like or how old they are, and they are likely to talk about gender in ways very similar to how a gender studies professor would talk about it. They may not realize who they're parroting, but they are parrots nonetheless, and they don't even know it. They've adopted these beliefs, or pretended to, and we'll return to that in a minute, the pretending part of it. Now, beyond the average adults walking down any average sidewalk, the most powerful institutions are fully in thrall to this mania. This is particularly the case among the medical, pharmaceutical, and psychological industries, and within education. I talked to a therapist who was ready to affirm me as a woman because I confessed to enjoying scented candles. In all seriousness. I did also mention, in fairness, that I've seen Sex and the City one time, and so that's what put me over the edge, and she said, well, that's a good question. Maybe you're a woman. I talked to a pediatrician who refused to even agree that only female chickens lay eggs. And she would not agree with that because she said she doesn't know a chicken's gender identity. Very, very real. I talked to a college professor who called me condescending and rude because I use the word truth. Now, these people are not fringe within the institutions they represent. They are utterly standard commonplace. This is what they're all like. And through these institutions, these ideas are fed to the public. They're dumped out onto the masses like a giant sewage pipeline. Children, of course, are most susceptible, as many children in our country today are indoctrinated into the gender cult practically from birth. They're put on the path to identity crisis and mutilation and despair and oftentimes suicide before they're even out of diapers. They're exploited, indoctrinated, lied to, drugged. They are chemically castrated with drugs that are meant for cancer patients, with drugs that we actually do give to pedophiles and sex offenders to chemically castrate them. We give those same drugs to 12-year-old boys. Now, I talked to a pediatrician, as I mentioned, who gives these drugs to kids, and I asked her about this, and I said, well, this same drug, Lupron, that you give to kids, isn't that used to chemically castrate sex offenders? And she said, this interview is over, and threatened to get up and leave. Although she kept sitting for a little while longer anyway, and she proceeded to lecture me and say that my questions were malignant and harmful, just because I wanted to know more about the drugs that she is prescribing to children. Quite a statement, by the way, malignant and harmful, coming from somebody who castrates children for a living. The effect is that now trans identification among the youngest generations has increased 20-fold over previous generations. Overall, 20% of Gen Z identifies as LGBT. 20%. Now let's put that into perspective. Among their grandparents' generation, the number is 0.8%. In fact, LGBT identification has almost exactly doubled in every generation for the past 5 generations in a row, and counting. This is all by design, of course. Our children face a very sophisticated, coordinated, and vast indoctrination campaign. I'll never forget the words that were said to me by somebody named Scott Nugent, who is a woman who, as an adult, transitioned to a man, or rather transitioned to appear like a man, as she put it herself in the documentary. And her experiences with transition have been hellish. They've been so bad, in fact, that the complications from the surgeries will one day kill her, as she told me. Now it's her mission to warn other people against falling into the same trap, especially children. And that's the part that haunts me. She said to me, you know, this got me at 42. Your child doesn't stand a chance. And for many children, she's right. The statistics prove it. Keep in mind, by the way, that as the LGBT club expands generationally, it also expands alphabetically, adding new letters, you know, to the acronym every single day, it seems. New categories of identity are invented and immediately affirmed. In the film, I interviewed a therapist who was once trans-affirming but has now backed away from that approach because she saw how far things were going, the depths that we were sinking to. And she told me about kids in school who identify as cats and are thus affirmed as cats, animals, in the school system. I followed it up by interviewing a man who actually identifies as an animal. He identifies as a woman and also as a wolf. Now, we laugh at the absurdity, because it is absurd, but then you realize what lies underneath it. The second thing I learned is that there's an immense amount of fear driving all of this. I said that so many of the people I encountered on the street appeared to be confused. Some of them actually were confused. One woman was particularly committed to the relativistic view that we all have our own truth. And I asked her, well, okay, if we all have our own truth, what would happen if it was my truth that you don't exist? And she looked me dead in the eyes and she said that if I think she doesn't exist, then she doesn't exist. And she was not joking. Now, I knew that women were being erased in our culture. That's part of the reason I made the movie. I didn't realize that some women were so eager to erase themselves. But more often, I encountered people whose confusion was more of a front. It was an affectation. They gave vague and dodgy answers to my questions because they were afraid to speak basic biological truths on camera. Many refused to say anything at all, telling me that if they talk about this issue with the cameras rolling, that it would mean the loss of their job, their friends, their family, their reputation. To be clear, their lives would be destroyed if they said something like, only women can have babies on camera, or any similarly provocative statement. Gender ideology paves the way for itself through fear, with intimidation, threats, coercion. The third point that's very important is that none of this is new, at least not as new as it may seem. The roots of modern gender ideology can be traced all the way back to the 19th century, in fact, arguably even earlier than that. But it really began to take its current shape in the mid-20th century thanks to the work of two hideously evil crackpots named Alfred Kinsey and John Money. These are names that everybody should know and few people do. In the interest of time, I'll focus on John Money for just a moment. It's worth looking into Alfred Kinsey, though. We talk about him in the film a little bit, but an even deeper dive is worthwhile. If you do, in fact, do that, make sure to have a vomit bucket handy. As for John Money, he was a prominent psychologist and sexologist and one of the early pioneers of the gender theories that are currently taught in grade schools and universities. He was among the first to take the word gender out of the realm of grammar and apply it to people. Because until him, we never said that people have a gender. Well, people have a sex, and gender is, words have gender. But he said, no, people have gender and sex. And he coined that. He also coined the terms gender role, gender identity, and sexual orientation. Suffice it to say, he was an extremely influential man, and anybody who propagates left-wing gender theory today is repeating at least some of the ideas of John Money, whether they know it or not, and most of them do not know it. That fact, I think, ought to trouble gender theory proponents because John Money was, among other things, a fraud and an abuser and a pedophile. Jumping to 1965, the birth of twins Bruce and Brian Reimer, the boys are born healthy except for a condition called phimosis, which affects the foreskin. And it was decided incorrectly, it turns out, that the best way to treat the condition was circumcision. But Bruce's procedure went horribly wrong and his penis was essentially burned off. After several months of grasping for answers, Bruce's parents eventually decided to take him to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore to see the renowned gender surgeon, Dr. John Money. And the good doctor, eager to prove the legitimacy of his theory that gender is a product of environment and culture, recommended that Bruce undergo sex reassignment surgery. So before the age of 2, the deed had been done, his testicles were removed, some crude approximation of female genitalia was formed, and Money instructed his parents to raise him as a girl and said that, well, this will work perfectly because gender is a social construct, so create a social construct of femininity for him, and he will be a her, and that will be it, happily ever after. Well, not so. The Reimer parents tried to follow Money's advice, but they found that Bruce was still Bruce, even if they called him Brenda. They did everything in their power to preserve his fragile and false female identity. Gender's a construct, they were told. Why should a boy raised as a girl still have boyish tendencies? Still, ultimately, Money was convinced that his project had been a smashing success, and he bragged of his triumphs in many published works. But it was not a success. The female identity never took hold for Bruce. He was confused and miserable and on the verge of suicide until, as a teen, his mother finally told him the truth. Bruce chose immediately to transition back to a boy, taking the name of David. He underwent another reassignment surgery, this time to try and reclaim his true self. And he felt better for a time, but neither his brother nor himself lived happily ever after. Ultimately, they both ended up committing suicide. Now, their deaths go down in history as suicides, but they were both effectively murdered by John Money, who's the father of modern gender theory. And that's the birth of gender ideology as we know it today. It was born in abuse and despair and death. And that is what it has reaped ever since. Number 4, the ultimate goal of gender ideology goes far beyond gender, a word which has been expanded, into oblivion anyway. The ultimate goal is to undermine, destroy, erase truth itself. Leftism is relativism, and relativism is the belief that there is no objective truth, no shared reality, no universal facts that we all have to conform ourselves around and submit ourselves to. The relativist claims the right to invent his own universe for himself, right? Even to the point of inventing himself. He seeks to be a self-created being, making and remaking himself as he sees fit, down to the very biological level. He believes that his ego overrides all else. Everything must bow before it: language, institutions, science, even his own DNA. This is why I found myself speaking to Pontius Pilate over and over again. What is truth? The gender ideologues would ask. Whose truth? Which truth are we talking about? I was sitting in the same room as them, but they would not agree that we were situated in the same reality. They get their own reality, they insisted. And that ultimately is what this is all about. It's about having your own reality. But here's the good news, finally, number 5, the final thing I learned from spending a year staring into this abyss is that we can win this fight. Gender ideology is insane, destructive, pervasive, ubiquitous, and beatable. You know, I get asked this all the time. You know, is this a hill that I want to die on? Do you want to die on this hill? And the answer is yes, I'll die on this hill. If there's any hill worth dying on, it's this one. The hill of objective truth. Yeah, I think that's pretty important. I'll die on that. But though I'm willing to die on this hill, I don't plan on it. As General Patton said back in the days before the military cared about equity and tolerance more than killing bad guys, he said, no bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making some other poor dumb bastard die for his. Well, I would say the same metaphorically for this hill, this fight for truth, this struggle against gender lunacy. We can win because the other side can be crushed under the weight of simple questions. I saw this happen myself before my very eyes time and time again. The learned, the educated, the experts crumpled and collapsed and panicked in front of me, just this bumpkin wearing flannel armed with a high school diploma, running out of the room. Is it because I'm brilliant? Well, those are my preferred adjectives. That's how I identify myself. But no, I don't have to be brilliant, fortunately. All you need to do is just stand up and look this thing directly in the face. Serve it a healthy dose of skepticism. Force it to explain itself. The gender ideologues are weak and scared and vulnerable. They've perched themselves on a limb that isn't even connected to a tree. They're anchored in nothing. Their worldview is empty and frail and flimsy. We don't need to be armed with anything but a spine, enough to stand up against them straight. Just stand up straight and ask questions. Questions that cannot be answered. Questions that, for that reason, aren't supposed to even be asked. But we must ask them. And if we do, we'll win. And we must win also. That's it for me, guys. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. God bless.